So let's talk about the American Revolution. Now, chances are you, as a person, already know a great deal about the American Revolution. In fact, you, as a person, can probably tell me most of the events that happened before, during, and after the Revolution, and that's because it's usually told in the form of a story. Now, historical events that become stories are usually the ones that we remember. Most people, even if they're not Russian, can basically tell you why the czars in Russia fell. Most people, even if you're not Greek, can sort of retell the life of Alexander the Great. Most people, even if you're not, Christian, can probably tell you the rough outline of the stories in the Bible. And that's because these are stories that get told and retold over and over again. So why is this story told so many times? Why do humans retell this story? It's because it's usually presented as a story of self-determination. It's a story about freedom versus domination. It's the story of the beginning of a movement across the world towards democracy and liberty. In fact, most of this story is sensationalized to us as people because it was sensationalized at the time by the people who were involved in it. People like Paul Revere, whose Midnight Ride was mythologized by Americans. He was also the silversmith who happened to depict the Boston Massacre, a name which itself is a piece of patriot propaganda intended to influence how you look at the event. People like Paul Revere, whose Midnight Ride was mythologized by Americans. He's also the silversmith who depicted the Boston Massacre, an event where the name itself is a piece of patriot propaganda intended to influence how you look at the event. Indeed, when one talks about the general causes of the revolution, people tend to repeat slogans that came to represent the cause. Things like, no taxation without representation. But this slogan, like all slogans, boils down the situation and the motivations of everybody involved, and it kind of reduces the conflict to one that is easier to explain and easier to retell to other people. I'm bringing this up because I believe that for all of the videos and documentaries that I've seen about the American Revolution, almost none of them seem to focus on the actual reasons that things are becoming and became the way that they did, which was money. Now, sometimes historians who evaluate the American Revolution on the basis of class tend to get very close to the actual facts on the ground, because they observe that the revolution in America was by and for rich white men. But this also kind of obscures the larger picture of what happened to make the landed gentry, who are usually the most conservative of people, decide to cut ties with the very power that enriched them and gave them security. The story that I'm going to tell you today is not a story about liberty or democracy or class struggles or even racial struggles. Though all of these things are a part of the story, there have been many historians who are much smarter than I am who have examined the revolution and talked about the revolution through these lenses. I do not feel that I am personally someone who can do that, and I don't believe that, honestly, I'm adding anything to the conversation if I was telling those stories. The story that I'm going to tell you is about money. It's about colonialism, and it's about the problems that governments have when they're trying to manage their populations, and ultimately about how attitudes in Europe created a situation where colonialism as a system broke down in much of the Americas. Now, before we can tell that story, we first need to explain the systems that underpin the entire relationship between America and Great Britain. Our story is going to begin in the medieval period of Europe. Now, for almost the entirety of the medieval period across Europe, the economic system that underpinned almost the entirety of society was feudalism. Now, feudalism is complicated, but we're going to boil it down to its simple parts. Under feudalism, there are two major participants in the wider economic system. There are landlords who own the land, and there are peasants who work the land. Now, this system didn't come about by accident, because under feudalism, those who worked the land were often considered property of their landowner, and they would be forced to give up some or even most of their crops to their landlords. The purpose of this video isn't to talk about how different parts of Europe had different rules and customs and ideas about how peasants were treated. How good or bad a peasant had it often depended on the place he was born and the character of his landlord. And this is meant to be a general summation of what is a deeply complex economic system, so you can understand the historical background of what we're actually going to talk about. So the landlords, in turn, had responsibilities to their peasants. First and foremost, they're expected to provide protection, because the medieval period is one of endemic warfare, and things such as horses and armor and weapons are very expensive to both acquire and maintain. Now, furthermore, they were expected to at least, on paper, represent the wider interests of the people that they ruled. The general idea can be summed up in the story of the Fisher King from the legend of King Arthur. Essentially, if the ruler is well, then the kingdom will be well as well. If the ruler is unwell, then the kingdom will suffer. Now, this system, which also had huge religious elements to it, was what most of European society was based on, and it remained based on this until the modern period. Now, there were places where this wasn't the case, but in general, the structure of society was uniform, and there was little to no chance of advancement within it. Now, this means that society is rigid almost across the board. If you weren't a landowner who could reasonably expect to conquer land in war, chances were that you and your family down the generations were not going to own your own land or progress in society, because land was property, and property wasn't bought as freely as it is today. As a result of this rigidity, when land was discovered in the Americas, the first inclination of the people who were colonizing it was to transplant the system that they had in Europe into these new territories. Now, before we go any further, there is a whole body of research about the people who already lived here, their cultures, and the genocide that occurred. This video is not going to go into that in great detail, because I'm assuming that you have the knowledge of this fact that colonialism is by design built around the exploitation of resources, whether those resources are plants, minerals, animals, or other human beings. Why and how this came about is what we're going to be talking about. But this story is not about the struggle between those who were there and those who subsequently conquered the lands of the Americas. For the purposes of this video, we're looking at colonialism as a system from the perspective of the Europeans who instituted it, with the full knowledge that this leaves out a major player in the story. But in order to ensure that we actually get to the American Revolution, it's enough for the purposes of this video to understand that to Europeans, the Americas presented a great deal of opportunity for them. Now, you're probably familiar with that concept already, because many stories about colonizing the New World emphasize things like people coming to the New World to start again, or to escape oppression, or to gain land they never would have had in the past. Most, if not all of this, is propaganda that was either in circulation at the time, or it was created after these places were settled to establish a foundational myth for their cultures. We're going to get to that, don't worry. The part that is likely different from the story that most of the people listening have been told is that for the first people who came to colonize, this was not an opportunity to try new things. This was an opportunity to expand the systems that already existed in Europe into new territory. So, for example, the Spanish colonized most of Central and South America, as they'd funded the expeditions of the explorers and would be the conquerors in hopes of gaining as much new territory as possible. The system that the Spanish put in place was remarkably similar to the systems that existed in Europe. They created a caste system with distinct and explicit racial components to it. Now, the territories that were conquered and colonized were incorporated as a part of the Spanish crown, which means that they were explicitly part of the wider Spanish dominion. Some people who are listening who have knowledge of the various South American independence movements will be aware that this caste system was not strictly about race, but also where you were born. A white man of property who was born in a colony was considered lower in the caste system than a white man of property that was born in Spain, and this would become the main reason landowners in Spanish territories gained revolutionary sympathies. But the reason that the Spanish were able to do this is because as an empire they were at the height of their power. They were the ones who could throw their weight around, both in terms of money and manpower. They had the largest navy at the time, and they were coming off the conquest of the entire Iberian Peninsula. There's a reason that during what was later called the Great Age of Piracy, the images of pirates attacking Spanish galleons that are filled with gold, and not galleons that are French or English. The Spanish had the capacity to rule the way they did because they had the power to enforce their rule as strongly as they did. As you can imagine, as the Spanish Empire declined, so too did their ability to project this power abroad. Now, in addition to the Spanish, there were the Portuguese, and then after them were the Dutch, both of whom tended to be less heavy-handed with their conquests, and instead decided to set up outposts and ports from which they could project power. They intrinsically understood that they lacked the manpower and the money to create a system like the Spanish did, and so their system tended to be much more hands-off, and as a result, far more palatable to many of the cultures that they came into contact with, at least at first. Now, the French also adopted a similar system of colonization, but this wasn't because the French couldn't project their power. It was simply that the entire story of French colonialism is one of laziness and disinterest. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and then late to the party, the English, all sent their best and brightest overseas to their colonies. The French, in contrast, viewed colonies as a place to dump your unwanted fourth or fifth child who wasn't in line for a military, civic, or church career. But let's get back to the English for a second. When I said that the English were late to the party, I meant it. Because despite their power in later centuries, the English got a very late start to the business of colonization, and furthermore, they couldn't really afford to finance it with money or manpower. The introduction of joint stock companies by the Dutch, which would give rise to the Dutch East India Company, and then later the British East India Company, allowed the British to pursue colonial ventures without themselves having to foot the entire bill for them. Now, this became increasingly important when the best land that the British could acquire in the Americas at first ended up being some islands in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, and the eastern coast of the United States. Now, here's where our story of colonialism begins to diverge. So, here's a question for you. What's the point of a colony? For what reason do you establish one compared to simply annexing the territory the way you would in Europe? Now, the answer to this question is that a colony exists for one purpose and one purpose only: the exploitation of resources for the betterment of the mother country. Now, earlier, I mentioned that what you consider a resource can be just about anything, from minerals to crops to human beings. But what I didn't say then was that last bit, which is that colonies exist to benefit the mother country. This is where things get murky in most stories about this period. Colonies are talked about primarily in terms of people moving to them to either force the native population out or to project power. They are talked about as being almost semi-autonomous, which is to say that when people talk about the American Revolution, people act as though the American colonies were somehow losing freedoms that they'd always had under this system, and that the British were being unfair in cracking down on them. This is not the case, as we're going to see. Colonies, by definition, do not have the freedom to do whatever they want. Indeed, an entire economic system was created to facilitate the extraction of wealth from the colonies to better the mother nation, and this was called mercantilism. Now, remember when I talked about feudalism a little bit ago? In a lot of ways, mercantilism was an attempt to structure the relationship between colony and country in the same way that peasants and landlords were related. Colonies essentially would work and provide resources, and the mother countries would protect them and govern them as needed, as well as supplying them with finished goods. But there's a wrinkle here. Colonies are not supposed to trade with just anyone. The only people that they're supposed to trade with is their mother nation. So, for example, British colonies in America aren't supposed to trade with Spanish merchants, the same way that Spanish colonies were forbidden to trade with British or French merchants. Now, for those of you who know a bit about European history, you'll know that this is nothing new under the feudal system. Many nations, especially ones that were frequently in war, forbid their own merchants and landowners from trading with enemy nations, and the solution to get around this were middlemen. And often these were of the Venetian and Genoese variety. So imagine this. If you're an Englishman who wants to drink French wines while England is at war with France, it's currently illegal to buy that wine from a French merchant because you'd be supporting French industry and thus you would be betraying your own country. But let's say that French merchant sells that wine to a Genoese merchant. Now you, as an English merchant, can buy that wine from them without breaking the law. Loopholes like this were the lifeblood of European trade for hundreds of years. That's why the Venetians and the Genoese became so rich. Now, as you can probably imagine, these traders do not exist in the Americas, because the only Europeans in the Americas are the various colonial powers. So this means that if you want things, that you can only get them from other nations. And if you have to get them from other nations, you have to rely on smuggling. Now remember this concept of smuggling because it's going to be very important to our story in a little bit. For the moment, let's just put the pieces of this puzzle together. So first, the English are extremely late to the colonialism party. And all of the obviously wealthy lands are mostly taken by bigger empires like Spain. And so as a result, they can only really settle for the eastern coast of North America and some territories in the Caribbean. Now, the American territories in particular lack a few things that other attractive colonies tend to possess. The most obvious thing that's lacking there are empires that can be easily taken over and then just run as subsidiaries of the crown, which is how the Spanish ran their empires in Central and South America. The Spanish method was to essentially kick out whoever was in charge and then use the system that was already in place to administer it, just with a Spanish ruler instead of a native one. But there's something else that's missing in these American territories that's extremely important for establishing a colony: gold. You see, the first settlers who came to America and settled in places like Jamestown, Virginia, were told a lot of lies about what they'd be doing there and what they would find. Now, would-be settlers were told that the Americas were a new Eden where winter didn't exist and food was so plentiful that you could just pick it off the trees. So as a result, colonists who went to places like Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, came equipped with a lot of things like shovels and picks and all manner of mining equipment for all the gold that they'd be looking for, and very little in the way of, planting seeds or farming equipment. And so those of you who are familiar with the mythologized stories of the first Thanksgiving will likely remember how much of a focus the kindness of the Native Americans is. The part that is not gone into is why their kindness was so important. The answer is that the colonists who were sent to the American colonies by the British were wholly unprepared for what they would actually be doing there. Starvation occurred extremely quickly, as did other conditions that come from lacking basic nutrition, and if that didn't kill you, you might still freeze to death once winter occurs, because it turns out there is in fact winter in Massachusetts and Virginia. To give you an example of how bad things were, of the people who landed at Plymouth Rock, almost half of them died during the first winter from starvation and exposure, which was brought on by the extremely poor planning on behalf of the people who were running the expedition. Now, it's important to note that colonies are very expensive to run, and they're very expensive to maintain, which is why the extraction of resources is so important to their survival. A colony that can't ship something valuable back home to justify expenditure in both wealth and manpower is simply not worth having. However, the English, who would become the British, saw what happened the last few times they dismissed this whole colonization thing. Because the Spanish had taken a gamble and made more gold than they could reasonably ship. The Dutch made fortunes on trade. The Portuguese brought back all kinds of new discoveries and established the first slave outposts in West Africa. Even the French, who didn't care much at all for colonization compared to mainland European development, had made a lot of money with their near monopoly on the fur trade in the Americas. So as a result, the English were not going to abandon their colonies in the Americas, thus allowing someone else to possibly take them over and then later find gold that they happened to miss. The colonies had to, somehow, provide a net benefit to the English, and their eventual solution was to make North America their dumping ground. You see, long before the British were sending all of their unwanted people to places like Australia, it was sending them to America. But this isn't to say that they got set up in penal colonies and the like the way they did in Australia. In fact, the concept of America as a place to send lots of people the English didn't like was a solution to two problems that they ended up creating for themselves. Now, the first problem was that over the course of a few hundred years, the English and then the British legal system became extremely punitive. So, from the time that the colonies in the Americas were founded by the British to the American Revolution, the amount of crimes that you could be put to death for quadrupled. Now, these were known as the Bloody Codes, and they were ostensibly designed to deter crime booms that inevitably resulted at the end of wars, when sailors and soldiers suddenly found themselves out of work because most of these countries did not have permanent standing armies. In practice, however, crime didn't decrease. It just became much bloodier, because children as young as 11 were legally required to be put to death for what today would be called petty theft, because the death penalty was put in place for crimes as small as stealing pieces of fruit from a fruit stand. In fact, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the people who are making these laws and the people whose job it was to actually execute them, because judges quickly found that sentencing children to death created a lot of hostility towards them and the system itself. So, furthermore, we should remember that while these were agents of the crown, charged with executing the law, that these were also people. And many judges found it increasingly hard to justify sending so many people to hang over what most people considered minor offenses. And so as a result, the practice of transportation became increasingly common. Now, transportation is a sentence where the judge basically says, you, the condemned criminal, rather than being hanged, will be told to report to a British ship. And from there you will be shipped to a British colony. And once you're there, you will be sentenced to some form of labor, and you will be forced to work off your sentence. And then once you're done with that, you will be freed and released into the colony to ostensibly provide some benefit to it. But beyond the bloody codes, the second problem that the colony solved was what to do with the sheer amount of religious dissidents that existed within the English nation. England, since the time of Henry VIII, had been a Protestant nation whose head of state was also the head of the English Church. However, much like on the continent, the English found that embracing Protestantism quickly resulted in lots of localized sects springing up, many of whom were actively hostile to the Anglican Church as an idea. And these groups, which you've likely heard of, included denominations such as the Puritans and the Quakers. Now, remember that group that landed at Plymouth Rock? They were made up of an even more radical sect of the Puritans who called themselves the Separatists, and their ideology is basically summed up in their name. Now, during this time, religious conflict in Europe was practically endemic, as Protestants and Catholics fought wars of religion, and Protestant and Catholic populations committed pogroms and genocide against each other. During this time, anyone who wasn't of the right religion in an area might find themselves under suspicion by their neighbors, who might consider them either A, evil, or B, agents of a hostile foreign power. The colonies essentially represented an opportunity to solve two problems at once. You can solve the problem of your colonies not having people in them, and you can solve this problem of having all of these people you don't like close to home by shipping them overseas, where they can do their weird religious cult things on their own, away from you. Now, as it turns out, this proved to be very successful for everybody involved, because the various petty criminals got to keep their lives, the weird religious dissidents got to be far away from the British Church, and the British state got to operate without having to think about dissidents at home. Everybody, essentially, is happy with this arrangement. Now, over time, the British came to the realization that there wasn't any gold in the North American colonies, and so they pivoted to other industries, such as the fur trade, plantation farming, and the like. This system of mercantilism worked fine in that the colonies would send raw materials like timber and tobacco back to Britain, and Britain would then send finished goods to the colonies, and everybody walked away happy. Or at least they would have if Britain had bothered to pay more attention to the American colonies, because you see, within 100 years or so, the colonies possessed a population whose monetary needs outstripped the amount of money that was actually in circulation. Now, what I mean is that British coins were made of gold and silver, and they expected transactions with the crown to be paid in gold and silver. Now, in a place like Jamaica, where there weren't as many people, this worked just fine. But this worked less fine in a place like Virginia, where there simply wasn't enough coinage in circulation to actually facilitate day-to-day transactions. Now, obviously, people still needed to do things like pay taxes, pay for goods, and they couldn't return to the barter system. And so as a result, paper money came into circulation. Now, we today are very familiar with paper money, especially in the United States, but at the time, this was a very new invention. The concept that you could hand somebody a piece of paper that said it was worth a certain amount of money, and that this person would accept that in exchange for goods, was a brand new idea. And obviously, counterfeiting was a huge problem. But more than that, the twin issues of inflation and overprinting were a constant threat to the whole system. There was no central banking system in this period, because instead of that, every private bank just printed their own currency, at least at first. Now later on, individual colonies would then turn over and begin to print their own currency, so you had one currency for New York and another currency for Virginia, and if you wanted to do business across state lines, you needed to know the exchange rates. Now, there is something very important that you need to keep in mind here. The British Crown did not consider this paper money to be valid currency for the purposes of things like paying debts or paying taxes. The British Crown demanded that all debts be paid in gold and silver coinage, the same way that you would in Britain. Now, this obviously creates a problem, because how exactly are the colonists going to pay for taxes in gold and silver if there's no gold and silver in the colonies with which to pay the taxes? This wasn't a problem in other colonies in the Americas, who either had gold reserves that were in the ground, or they were small enough in population to make paying taxes possible with what money they took in. But the colonies were filled with people who, in their day-to-day lives, did not take lots of gold and silver coinage from the British motherland. And under the system of colonialism, the entire point was to ensure that gold flowed from the colonies into Britain, not from Britain into the colonies. So as a result, you end up with a problem, where Britain increasingly struggled to collect taxes from the colonies in a currency they considered valid. But, at first, this problem would go unaddressed, for what we might call benign neglect. You see, the British, focused as they were on the rest of their increasingly large empire, did not really enforce the rules of mercantilism as harshly in the American colonies the way they did elsewhere. And so as a result, smuggling wasn't simply rampant, it was a way of life for many people. Now, John Hancock, the man who would one day pen many of the founding documents of the United States, was known as the most prominent smuggler in the American colonies. Nearly all of the colony's most prominent men were engaged in smuggling in one way or another. So here's how it worked. Legally speaking, the colonies were only allowed to trade with Britain. In reality, the colonies would trade for what they needed with other powers, such as the French and Spanish. American colonists would trade timber and tobacco, for example, to the Spanish in exchange for gold and silver, which they would then use to pay British taxes. Now, one of the reasons that this system worked so well was because the British didn't directly tax the colonies. Rather than tax the colonies directly, as they did with their native-born citizens in Britain, the British Crown instead charged taxes on goods, which the colonists had to buy from them. Remember, under the system of mercantilism, the colonists are forced to buy goods from the British, and only from the British. So marking up the price of goods as a way to collect taxes without having to actually tax people made sense. There was no need to directly tax the colonists, because they were paying taxes on every purchase they made, in gold and silver, of course. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see why this system worked, and we can also see immediately how it might immediately break down. Because if any part of the system is disturbed, it's all going to fall apart. If, for example, hyperinflation occurred in the colonies, or perhaps Britain cracked down on smuggling, or perhaps decided to, say, tax the colonists directly, then this whole system falls apart, and the economy would probably end up in a death spiral. Unluckily for everyone, all of these things occurred almost all at once, thanks to the 7 Years' War. Now, for those of you who are European and aren't aware of this, in America, the 7 Years' War is more commonly known as the French and Indian War. And it's not simply because we like naming things differently. The reason is that while the war did indeed take place over 7 years in Europe, in the colonies, the fighting lasted for 9 years, as it both began sooner and ended later thanks to how slow information traveled across the Atlantic. Now, during this time, while the British did want to protect their American colonies, their focus was on their other, richer possessions. And so as a result, American colonists did in fact need to raise militias and pay for them on their own. Colonies, who had no way to pay for soldiers beyond paper money, printed lots and lots of it, which inevitably resulted in hyperinflation and devaluation of that currency nearly to the point where it's worthless. Now, this was expected to a point, because you see, the colonial assemblies that issued these paper notes knew that printing more of them would in fact create inflation. And so as a result, most of them would also issue a tax equal to how much that they were printing. This tax was designed to be paid a few years later. Now what this would do is ensure that whatever they were printing would be reabsorbed through taxation, and this would ensure that inflation didn't ruin things forever. The war essentially messed all of this up because it required large amounts of new currency. But here's the thing, and I want you to keep this in mind. Given time, the colonies would in fact have reabsorbed all of the extra money in circulation. But you see, the war did more than just upset the economic system in the colonies. The 7 Years' War was in many ways the first global war. Battles were fought from the Americas to India as colonial powers in Europe found that they had to defend territory all over the globe. Now, this proved to be very expensive. Colonial powers had traditionally outsourced their conflicts to others, namely privateers, during earlier conflicts. But as colonies became more established, they became more valuable, and trying to defend these far-flung possessions was very difficult. The result is that by the end of the war, nearly everybody involved in it was bankrupt, and they all had to figure out how to recoup their losses. The British, for their part, decided that what they really needed to do was reevaluate how they managed the American colonies. Because you see, the war began there, allegedly because of a conflict involving a French diplomat and George Washington. The British had spent a lot of money and a lot of manpower trying to defend them, and so the British decided that they really needed to take a firmer hand in running these colonies. But you have to understand the perspective of the British, because at the end of the war, the British have just signed the peace treaty, and they immediately go to look at the situation in the colonies, and what they see horrifies them. Because a quick look at the financial situation in the colonies told the British that the colonists were not prepared to govern themselves. As I said, the colonies printed a lot of paper notes to pay for all of these soldiers during the war, and hyperinflation had destroyed the economies of almost all of the colonies at this point. Now, the colonies argued, probably correctly, that given a few years, that the economic issue would stabilize as the taxes that they had also issued would soak up all of this extra currency. But the British are not interested in listening to the colonies that looked like they couldn't govern themselves. Because again, the colonists have now started a war that bankrupted most of Europe, and also managed to destroy their own economies by printing way too much money in a denomination that the British do not consider valid. So, to get a handle on things, the British demand that paper money stop being circulated. Furthermore, they demanded that the colonies use the same system of currency that everybody else in the empire did, which means gold and silver. Now, while demanding this, the British began to actually enforce the mercantilist rules that they hadn't before, which means that smuggling is now being punished accordingly. Keep in mind, in the colonies, smuggling is a way of life. It is considered to be a victimless crime. But as the British saw it, smugglers are colonists refusing to abide by the laws of the empire. So what the British have effectively done is outlawed most of the currency that's in use in the colonies, and they've cut off the supply of gold and silver that the colonies actually had through smuggling. So now let's see what happens when the British reevaluate how they tax the colonies. Because as stated before, the British didn't directly tax the colonists. They instead levied taxes on goods that the colonists had to buy, allowing the colonists to pay taxes without being taxed directly. The British, however, are trying to recoup their losses in defending these colonies, and so they begin to bring the American colonies into the same taxation system that the rest of the British Empire was under. And this meant direct taxation to be paid in gold and silver. Problems appeared almost immediately, because you see, the colonies didn't have gold and silver with which to pay their taxes, and said as much to the British. The British, however, assumed that the colonists were lying to them, that they must have the gold and silver somewhere, and that they're basically just hiding it. Now, this is important to remember when we get into what the British were taxing and their plans for extracting the wealth from the colonies. Okay? Now, some people will often say, for example, that your average colonist paid a fraction of the taxes that a British citizen in Britain did, and that this means that the colonists were being unreasonable. But this obscures the whole story, because one problem that I'll keep going back to is the manner in which taxes were meant to be paid. The second problem I'm going to go back to, as I'm about to get into, is what was being taxed and what that actually meant for the colonies and the people living there. So, let's set the scene. It's 1765. The economy in the colonies is in ruins. It's suffering from hyperinflation due to the colonies printing way too much money to pay for their own militias during the French and Indian War. The British, seeking to recoup some of their own losses due to the massive debts they ran up, decide that they need to take a firmer hand in the colonies, and that they must be paid in gold and silver, which is valid coinage. Furthermore, they reinforce the rules that are already on the books regarding trade that they just hadn't enforced before, and this forces goods to be transported on British ships and punishes anyone who, say, acquired gold and silver to pay their taxes from other nations. The British begin this whole mess by passing the Stamp Act, which for the first time directly taxed the colonies. Now, a lot has been written about the Stamp Act, and a lot of it is left out. Now, as stated previously, the inclusion of this tax didn't actually harm the colonists that much financially. And this is where people explain the situation by talking about the concept of no taxation without representation, and talking about things like freedom and liberty, and they throw in a lot of buzzwords. I want you to forget all about that, for a moment anyway. Because what's actually happening is something much more mundane, and it explains why the anger becomes so intense. As many people will remember from their days in grade school, the Stamp Act was a tax paid on any piece of paper that was bought within the colonies. Now, people really like to point to things like playing cards, pamphlets, almanacs, as examples of how intrusive this tax was. But in truth, the one that really bothered the colonists was the fact that this tax was affixed to official documents. Official documents for things like, say, court documents. So imagine this situation. You are an American colonist. You've fallen on hard times because the American colonial government has printed way too much money. Now, the British are demanding that you pay for everything in gold and silver. And when you can't pay them in gold and silver, they take you to court as a debtor to seize your assets, such as, say, your farm or your business. Now, while you're in court, lots and lots of papers are being generated in order to facilitate court business. And now, since the Stamp Act, each of these pages has to be affixed with a stamp, and taxes need to be paid on these papers. And the person who has to pay the costs of these taxes is you, the person who they're bringing to court. So not only are the British trying to seize your assets and squeeze you for gold and silver that they believe you're hiding from them, they're burying you in court fees, because every piece of paper that is created in the course of this mess has taxes associated with it, continuously increasing the debt that you owe. Even if you win your case against the British, you'll probably be ruined financially from all the taxes you now have to pay on the court documents that are being generated. Now, if that was all it was, you would probably expect some issues, but you wouldn't expect widespread rage the way we actually saw. And here is where the concept of representation gets introduced. Now, you see, traditionally, tax collectors and court magistrates were from the colonies where they were being collected. This makes some sense. I mean, most colonists saw themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Marylanders far more than they ever saw themselves as Americans. Furthermore, the logic went that if the guy who's collecting your taxes or passing judgment on you was someone that you personally knew, you were less likely to cause problems because you knew the guy personally. So let's imagine this again for a second. Bob is your tax collector, and he's also your magistrate for the purposes of this. He's responsible for lots of things you really don't like, but you understand that he has a hard job, and he's just trying to do it. You've been to his kids' baptisms, you've talked with him at local assemblies, he's one of you. But see, now things are really bad, and Bob doesn't exactly feel good about having to seize the property of all of his friends and neighbors. And he really doesn't feel good about burdening them with tons of taxes on top of all of that. And more importantly, everybody around him is pressuring him not to do it. And Bob can't really upset everybody that he knows, so he stops being able to collect the taxes and seize property effectively. So the British, seeing this, decide that what they need are people who can't be gotten to by the locals. And so they begin a process of appointing magistrates and tax collectors from outside the colonies that they're assigned to. So now, if you're in New York, your tax collector is now from Rhode Island. If you're from Virginia, your magistrate that's been seizing your property is from Rhode Island. And as it turns out, when people have no affinity for the people who are causing them material harm, they tend to get a lot more extreme. So in our example, the people know Bob. They've lived with Bob their entire lives. They don't know this new guy named Steve. Steve's an outsider. So they're going to do things like burn down Steve's house. And maybe they'll tar and feather him and pour hot tea down his throat. They're also going to do something that still happens today, where auctions for seized property are attended by everybody in the community. And because of this, no one bids, ensuring that the people who are seizing the land won't make a profit from it. Now, this kind of communal resistance had a name. It was called rough music. Now, beyond the physical acts of aggression, beyond the terror zone against people trying to enforce the Stamp Act, the colonists begin to boycott British goods. And this causes a lot of headaches for the various British merchants who considered colonial businesses as their primary market. Because remember, British merchants are supposed to have a monopoly on the colonies. But this works kind of both ways, because you see, British merchants aren't allowed to trade with anyone else either. And so if British merchants can't sell goods to the colonies, they're going to lose a lot of money. So the end result of the Stamp Act is that the colonies are now very angry. Merchants aren't making any money, and the British government isn't paying off its debt. So the British Parliament decides that the best course of action at this point is to repeal the Stamp Act. Oh, all those demands that I mentioned earlier about paying your taxes in gold and silver, that's all staying. But at least you're not being charged for all of these court documents when they foreclose on you. Perhaps a little surprisingly and counter to most narratives that most people are told about this situation, the British don't see the repealing of this tax as the end of the world. Taxes have been repealed in the past, and it's not entirely uncommon for new taxes to be extremely unpopular. And so the British do what they've always done, which is they sit down, they look at who is angry and why they're angry, and they reevaluate how they're going to get their money. Because to the British, this is all about money. This is not about anything else. The British, seeing the failure of the Stamp Act, feel that the colonists are mad because they objected to direct taxation. They're assuming that the colonists are not going to object to increased taxes in a manner that they had already been used to, which is, for example, the customs duties they've been paying for basically ever. Because again, the colonists already buy goods at markups from the British due to the system of mercantilism. Furthermore, the British evaluated where the issues with the Stamp Act were most prominent. And what they decide is that the issue was that the taxes fell on the middle and lower classes. This imposition on the poor and rural communities, which by and large have strong local bonds due to a lot of them being very religious, was, in the eyes of the British, why they had essentially struggled to collect the taxes in the first place. So when they come back to impose their next tax, they do it completely differently. The Townshend Acts were a number of acts which increased customs duties on luxury goods, such as paper, glass, sugar, tea, and other expensive items that were most often bought by people of means, like, say, richer landowners who ran plantations and estates all across the colonies. These were the people the British assumed that could both A, afford the new tax, and B, didn't have the same connection to the general population that the middle and lower classes did. In other words, the British have decided that the guys who would eventually show up at the Continental Congress would be the ones who were paying a little more in taxes this time. And as you can imagine, those guys aren't happy. But rich people having to pay more in taxes isn't the kind of thing that's going to make people super angry. No, what makes them really angry is the fact that the Townshend Acts further restrict and clarify the rules around who can trade what in the colonies. In other words, your goods are now more expensive, and the people who are trading illegally are now more likely to get caught. So the fact that smuggling is being cracked down on is a big deal. Again, I'm reiterating this because it's super important. Remember that many people in the American colonies view smuggling as a way of life. It is a thing that everybody does and nobody had cared about for almost a century. So to the Americans, this is a new imposition upon them by the British. But to the British, they're just enforcing the rules that have always been on the books. These are the rules that were put in place when the colonies were established. There's a fundamental disconnect between these two parties. And it's here that we get the seeds of the Boston Massacre. As I said, the name itself is a piece of propaganda. Indeed, most of the stories that follow this propaganda talk about the event as being caused by increasing British crackdowns on liberty, seemingly for no reason. And in fact, in most of these retellings, most of the acts by the British are depicted as being unfair and tyrannical. I want you to put all of that aside for a moment, because the sequence of events, as they actually happened, are very logical and easy to follow. The British have, as I said, decided to crack down on smugglers. This leads them to seize a ship owned by a man named John Hancock. Yes, that John Hancock, because he's known as the richest and most prominent smuggler in Boston. Now this causes a riot to break out, and the British customs officials are forced to flee the scene to save their own lives. Now, this causes the British to do two things. First, they decide to deploy troops to Boston in order to protect their customs officials from angry colonists. And second, the British decide that they can't effectively try criminals in the colonies. They feel that any attempt to do this is only going to cause more problems. Or worse, magistrates will let criminals off the hook because they're afraid of their own lives. And so as a result, they reinstate an act that had been on the books for over 200 years, known as the Treason Act of 1543. Now, the details of the Treason Act aren't really important. The important part, for the purposes of this video, is that the act allows British officials to formally seize people in the colonies and transport them back to Britain for trial. So in essence, it's an extradition act, and it's aimed at ensuring that the smugglers in the colonies will actually face justice. As you can probably imagine, these two decisions go over very poorly with the colonists in Boston. The colonists do not see a government cracking down on criminals. They see a government willing to abduct their citizens for victimless crimes and ship them overseas to have them face execution in courts that are stacked against them. Now, some people might remember that part of the Constitution that will later be written regards a jury of your peers. And here is where they get the idea that this is important. But again, this is about money. And the British aren't backing down. The British are determined to bring the colonists to heel. And they assume, rather wrongly, that a token amount of troops is going to be enough. So now, it's March. March in Massachusetts, as it turns out, is very cold. And so here's the scene. There are British soldiers standing around doing their jobs. A crowd begins to form, and they're not very happy. Now at first they're just throwing insults, but then they start doing things like throwing snowballs. And then they start hurling rocks and oyster shells. And finally, someone decided to club a soldier over the head. And so now the crowd is a mob, and the soldiers, perhaps rightfully so, panic. One of them, we're not sure who, fires. And the rest, hearing the gunshot, all fire. 5 people are killed. And then, of course, Paul Revere rides off to depict the event as a bunch of soldiers lining up in a row and shooting into a crowd. So as you can see, he's definitely someone trying to calm the situation down. But, as you can see in reality without sarcasm, the situation is now rapidly spiraling out of control. It's getting very heated. People have died. The British know they need to impose order, and they're running out of ideas. But what they know more than anything is that this whole Townshend Act thing isn't working. In fact, it's doing the opposite of what they wanted. Because remember, they decided to implement these acts because they assumed that taxing rich people and taxing them in a way that everybody had already been taxed would bring the temperature back down. Instead, it's now never been higher. So what they decide to do is repeal the Townshend Acts. Or, at least, they repeal every part of it. Except for one, a tax on tea. Now this is not the Tea Act, much like the first riot that I described was not the Boston Massacre. Many people act like this is the Tea Act, but it's not. It's still 1770 after all. And surprisingly, much to the chagrin of people like Paul Revere, things actually do begin to settle back down. No, I'm serious, they do. Like, the general population actually begins to kind of chill out, and things almost look like they're gonna get better. But remember, there's still a section of the population who are, at this point, absolutely committed to making things worse. So 2 years go by, after the Townshend Acts are repealed. It's 1772. A bunch of members of the Sons of Liberty, who are, by and large, merchants who really hate trade regulations. They decide to show just how much they hate the new regulations by burning down a British ship. Again, this is not the Boston Tea Party. Now, this wasn't just any ship. It was called the HMS Gaspee. Now, this was a ship that was specifically involved in enforcing customs regulations, meaning it was there to crack down on smuggling, which, as we've gone over, the Sons of Liberty really hate because most of their members are smugglers. Now, a year goes by. Letters are published that reveal that the governor of Massachusetts has advocated for greater restrictions of liberty against the colonists in Boston. Now, it's probably the case that he's just sucking up to British officials in London. But the publication of these letters causes a riot, and the colonists burn down the governor's house. Upon investigating why this happened, it's revealed that the man who published them was Ben Franklin, and he is the representative of the colonists in England. He's the guy who is supposed to be explaining to the British what they need to do. As you can imagine, this gets him fired. So now, the British have gone through all of the stages of frustration. They have tried, in their minds, everything. Now, they're going to be petty. They're going to pass the Tea Act. Now, it is very likely that everything that you've heard in pop history about the Tea Act is wrong. Everything that you were probably taught in school about the Tea Act and about why the colonists are angry about the taxes on tea is wrong. Because the Tea Act is not, in fact, a tax on tea. In fact, the Tea Act takes a tax off of tea. What the Tea Act did was reduce the taxes on British East India Company tea, which makes it cheaper than the tea that's being smuggled into the country. So this means that all those rich smugglers, your Sons of Liberty people, are going to lose business, because now the legal tea is cheaper than the stuff that's smuggled into the colonies. But the British are not done being petty. Oh no, they went even further, because the British established special merchants to sell the tea directly to colonists, essentially bypassing the colonial merchants who would normally buy and then resell the tea. In other words, the British government is now involved in selling cheaper tea to the colonists, directly undercutting colonial merchants and businesses. This is a giant middle finger to all of the people who have been causing all of the problems for the British. However, the smugglers and rich merchants don't give up. In fact, in many places they resort to the same tactics that had gotten the Stamp Act repealed, specifically by refusing to allow the cheaper British tea to be unloaded from ships, and by refusing to do business with the special British merchants. In many places, this is successful. However, it wasn't successful in one place specifically, Boston. So remember that governor that I mentioned before, the one that got his house burned down by angry colonists when it came out that he was on the side of the British? Well, he's still in charge, and he absolutely refuses to allow the Bostonians to stop the sale of British tea, overriding the assemblies in Boston. Now, as a result of this declaration that the tea will be brought ashore and it will be sold, a bunch of guys in the Sons of Liberty, led by a man who you might have heard of named Samuel Adams, decide to take matters into their own hands. Adams and company decide that the best plan of action is to dress like Native Americans, very badly, in fact, specifically Mohawks, and then they boarded the ships that were carrying the tea, and they dump it into the harbor. At the time, this amounts to around 10,000 pounds. Now, for those who are curious, today, when this is being recorded in 2023, that comes to about 1,884,426 pounds. Or, if you're an American like myself, that amounts to around $2,388,131. That is not a small amount of money, especially back then. So this becomes known as the Boston Tea Party, and as you can probably imagine, the British freak out. Okay, they are absolutely beyond done with all of this. They decide that since the colonists cannot rule themselves like decent civilized people, they're going to get ruled directly. The British now pass 5 more acts, which in America come to be known as the Intolerable Acts. The first act revokes the colonial charter of Massachusetts, removing its ineffective governor, and it puts the colony under the jurisdiction of the British government directly. This act also restricts meetings between people by limiting what the meetings can be about and how many people can be involved in them. The second act shows that the British decide that they're done acting like the colonies are equal to Britain, in terms at least of carrying out justice, and at least for soldiers. So remember when the Boston Massacre happened? Those soldiers who fired were tried in an American court of law, and they were acquitted. But the British are not taking any chances. From now on, any soldier that is brought up on any charges will be tried in Britain under British law. Essentially, what this looks like to the colonists is any British soldier who commits any illegal act against colonists will then be removed from the colonies to be tried in Britain and likely acquitted, because why else would you move them back to Britain if not to let them get away with things? The third act directly punishes Boston for the Boston Tea Party. Essentially, until the pill for the tea is paid, Boston Harbor is closed for business. So as you can imagine, that's bad news for a lot of people, including beyond Boston, because it's one of the biggest ports for trade in the colonies in general. The fourth act is the Quartering Act, and this reestablishes how British soldiers are going to be housed in the colonies, all of the colonies. Because previously, the way in which British troops were housed was that the colonies would be told, hey, you need to build a barracks, and you're going to pay for it. And then the colonies would build the barracks, and then the soldiers will come, and they will live in those barracks. However, as the years have gone by, the colonies begin to resist building these barracks, and it's not just happening in Massachusetts. So the British say, okay, we're now allowed to house troops anywhere we want. If you don't build the barracks, we'll just put them in your home, and you're going to pay for it that way. So while we build the barracks, you are going to support our troops. In the case of Boston, the troops that are sent there to enforce the closing of Boston Harbor are in fact quartered in the homes of citizens while they build that barracks. But this act specifically applies to all of the colonies, not just Massachusetts. And this is intended as a threat towards all of them not to follow the examples being set there. Now, the fifth act is usually omitted by popular histories, but I think this is a mistake. And it's called the Quebec Act, and it involves two things. The first is land speculation, and the second is religion. So first and foremost, Quebec and much of Canada had been seized by the British in the French and Indian War. This sets off a huge amount of land speculation by rich colonists, many of whom would later sign that Declaration of Independence. One of the ideas that would get tossed around during the Revolutionary War was when to invade Canada, not because it held much in the way of strategic value, but because of how much money lots of the guys who would then become the founding fathers had poured into land speculation. Let me explain. The Ohio Company, known also as the Ohio Company of Virginia, was a company that did things like trade with the French and Native Americans. But it's also heavily involved in speculating on land. Land that they don't have access to. Land that they weren't legally allowed to settle. Land that the British frequently had to drag people off of because they weren't supposed to be there. Land that was sold to lots of rich people who later signed the Declaration of Independence on the promise that when that land became open, they'd be even richer than they already were. Land that is now explicitly British Crown property, thanks to the Quebec Act. All that money that they spent speculating on land, gone. Or at least it would be gone if the act is enforced properly. But as we all know, something being illegal or unlikely has never stopped people from gambling on it, and this was no exception. The religious issue is also very important, but in a way that doesn't get brought up much, because in hindsight, it seems kind of odd. So the Quebec Act states that it's legal for Catholics to practice in Quebec, free of interference from the British government. It recognizes that Quebec is Catholic. Now, this is because the territory had been French, and the French were a Catholic power. So the majority of people who are living in Quebec were, unsurprisingly, Catholic. But the British were Protestant. And to ensure that Quebec was easier to manage, they declared on no uncertain terms that the British are not going to interfere with religion. So, Why are American colonists upset about this? Well, in their mind, this wasn't the British saying that it's okay to be Catholic. They read it as the British are saying that Quebec is Catholic, which amounts to the establishment of a religion by the state. Remember that the British had shipped over lots of religious dissidents to America with the promise that they wouldn't mandate religious practices there. Now, calmer, more rational people today might wonder why anyone think that the British, if they were going to mandate a religion, would mandate one that's not theirs, since the head of Britain is head of the English Church. But the colonists aren't really acting or thinking rationally. They spin this as British intending to bring all of the colonies under Anglican dominion. They're just telegraphing it by establishing Catholicism in Quebec. But the colonies, you see, are next. If this sounds like conspiracy theory talk, that's because it is. And it doesn't help that the American colonies see the British being nice to people. The colonists spent 9 years fighting, and the colonists now argue that there's a double standard in place. The British are being nice to people who they conquered and cruel to their own citizens in the colonies. Or at least, so the colonists are saying. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Bill of Rights will see a lot of the things that are in there right here. There's no quartering of troops in your home, no imposing a religious mandate on people, no banning assemblies, so on and so forth. Furthermore, the story of the Revolution is fairly straightforward from this point. The colonists grow more incensed, the British go to seize some arms and ammunition at a place called Lexington. There's a shot that's heard around the world, and the revolution is on. In fact, it would be very easy for me to end this whole discussion here, because the goal of this entire video was not to recount the entire revolution, but to present to you the historical events in a different way. Most people are familiar with the basic sequence of events. My goal was to try and reframe them and focus on the economic issues that underpin it and downplay the ideological issues that are going on. But there is one thing we kind of need to talk about, and it involves a lot of really heavy topics, and it requires us to talk about events near the end of the revolution itself. We need to talk about the American South and the British Southern strategy and the institution of slavery. Now, at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that lots of other people have evaluated the American Revolution along racial and class lines. I am not qualified to give you the story of the American Revolution through the lens of race. However, I personally believe that if I leave out what I'm going to talk about, you will be given an incomplete understanding of the underlying dynamics of the war, the revolution, and the future after the revolution ends. I do not believe that it's treading new ground to say that the institution of slavery affected every part of the new American state, and it still affects the American state to this day. Slavery is a stain on our country's history, and it involved real, living human beings. But the human cost of this institution, the human element, is better discussed by experts. My goal for this section is not to focus on the history of the enslaved and their suffering. It's to talk about what the people in the British military were thinking and what the American colonists who were reacting to them were also thinking. I don't believe it's very surprising to anyone to hear that the people who were heavily involved in slavery, that the people who saw it as a normal thing that they had done for over a century, that the people who would continue to do it for decades more, that these people were not considering the human cost of their actions. They didn't because they didn't see slaves as being people. That's not surprising or new for anyone who knows about the history of slavery. I bring all of this up because I am going to be talking about the viewpoints of rich white men, and these men are going to think of slavery and slaves in purely economic terms. They will not be thinking about these people as people. They will think about slaves in purely economic terms. I feel the need to mention all of this, because to understand the economic calculations that are being made by the people in charge, you need to accept that what we see as innate humanity of an oppressed people, that these are an economic asset that exists to be systemically exploited by virtue of their skin color to the people we're talking about. There are lots of people who rightly tell the stories of the oppressed and exploited. They do good work. But the economic story of the revolution, in my opinion, doesn't weigh the stories of these people as heavily as the racial story of the revolution does. So I want you to keep all of this in the back of your mind when you hear about how people are reacting to the moves each side are making during this part of the war. If you're wondering why this preface is so long, it's because I'm attempting to explain why what I'm going to discuss is going to have a human-shaped hole in it. Because this won't be a discussion of people, but of money, of systems, and economics. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's quickly try and set the scene as best as we can. Slavery is a part of the colonies in the Americas essentially from the word go. Originally, when Columbus blundered into the Caribbean, he was told on no uncertain terms to absolutely not oppress the natives because the Spanish crown viewed these people as people to spread Christianity to. Columbus, however, in his traditional fashion, didn't listen to anyone and instead went a bit atrocity crazy. To the point that one of his crew members ended up becoming a monk because of how horrified he was by what was going on there. Now, originally, the enslavement of Africans wasn't economically practical, because most of West Africa was controlled, at least at this point, by the Portuguese, and shipping hundreds of thousands and then millions of people across the sea was expensive and it was dangerous, and there wasn't really yet a huge reason to do so. The hope of the various colonial powers was that they would be able to exploit the native people of the Americas the same way that they exploited every other conquered population in Europe. As I said much earlier, the Spanish got there first, and they tried and failed to import their ideas of how society should be run onto the people they conquered. And that meant that the native people were now subjects of the Spanish Empire, and they were going to be exploited as such. But this ran into a snag, because very quickly, the populations of the Americas were absolutely decimated by European diseases like smallpox, which they had never been exposed to and thus had no immunity to. I think it's impossible to truly overstate how absolutely destroyed the populations of the Americas were by disease. The Spanish on several occasions would show up somewhere, leave, and when they would come back, found that the entire population was gone. Entire populations of people, entire civilizations were destroyed by European diseases. And that was before the Spanish and others even begin to directly try to exterminate them. But this video is not, as I said, a breakdown of the racial and ethical questions of the period. I am bringing all of this up to explain why the Spanish begin introducing slavery into the Americas. Essentially, the Spanish found themselves with a massive labor shortage. They had intended to exploit the native populations by directly taking over the systems and the empires of the Americas. And now they're finding that this is impossible. They lack the manpower that they need to fill the plantations and mine the gold they found. Furthermore, there's no way for them to make this up with their own people. The Spanish are not the British, and they don't believe in sending people who disagreed with them away. In general, they believed in strong central authority, and to them, the idea of sending lots of people elsewhere, away from where the Spanish authorities could watch over them, was a bad idea. The Spanish usually preferred to expel their populations, as they did with the Jews, because they would rather someone else have that labor than risk descent from any population. Very quickly, the Spanish turned to the practice of slavery to make up the numbers that they need to do the hard labor they otherwise would not be able to do. And as other colonial powers enter the Americas, they too face the same problems that the Spanish did. Namely, that there's lots of hard, dangerous work, and they have no one to do these jobs. And so they adopt the practice of slavery to make this work. The result of this is that by the time of the American Revolution, slavery is an established, accepted practice by basically everybody involved. And in the southern colonies especially, slavery was the backbone of the economic prosperity of the landowning class. Now, much is often said about how many of the founding fathers in America owned slaves. But in many ways, it would have been stranger at the time if they didn't, given how important it was to the economy in these colonies. In Virginia and the Carolinas, slavery was the thing that allowed wealth to be generated. And it's not until factory work brings the northern economies up to par that rifts begin to form between the cultures of the North and the South. But it's important to note that even at the time of the American Revolution, everybody involved understood how important slavery was to the American economy, and they understood how important the southern economy was to the rest of the colonies. Northern cities like Boston and New York might be shipping hubs, but it was the South that produced the crops that were imported by the British, like tobacco and cotton. So let's once again set the stage. It's now 1778. The American Revolution has dragged on for what is now 3 long years. The British, having exhausted every attempt at putting down the revolt through various means in the North, reconfigure their approach. It's clear to them at this point that the northern colonies are hotbeds of revolutionary sentiment, and they're finding it harder and harder to establish footholds that they can then use to launch attacks from. It's at this point that the British decide to rethink their entire strategy. So far, the colonial South has been almost entirely untouched by the Revolutionary War. And this is because the British understand that when the revolt is put down, the economy of the South is what's going to make paying for all this much easier. The less they damage these southern colonies, the better. But the British are getting desperate, and so they read the lack of patriot sentiment in the American South as being loyalist sentiment. And they begin their invasion of South Carolina with the idea that they will then march north, having divided the colonies in two. There are several things we need to discuss here. The first of which is the huge miscalculation about how sentiment towards the British worked in the American South. In the North, which we've talked extensively about at this point, there's a lot of talk about things like freedom and democracy and liberty, because much of it is predicated on the merchant class that wants freedom from regulation and taxation. The economic system of the South is based around large and small landowners, many of whom own slaves, and so the question that many of them are asking is not, what's going to give us freedom, but which side is going to make life easier for us? The Southern plantation owners, essentially, view this conflict almost in neutral terms, because if a loyalist victory is likely, they'll side with the British to make themselves the good colonists. If the colonists are likely to win, they'll side with them in order to carve out the best benefits that they can inside the new country. And so as a result, the British view the southern colonies as being bastions of loyalist sentiment. And the northern colonies don't actually disagree with this, because many times during the early days of the war, the northern colonies complain bitterly that they're not getting enough support in manpower or materials from the South. The northern colonies are fighting tooth and nail for the freedom of all of the colonies. Or at least that's what they say, but only half of the colonies are acting like it matters to them. In reality, the situation is much, much more complex because, as I said, the question in the colonists' minds in the southern colonies is not who's going to give us the most rights, but who benefits us the most. Many places in the American South are divided between loyalists and patriots, but not because of loyalty to the crown or to some new idea of freedom, but because of personal animosity between the people who already live there. So there's a huge divide here between the landowners in the South and the various other settlers who live on the lands further to the west. The Carolinas are a mess of swamps and forests at this point, and lots of people have gone out there and resent the encroachment of large landowners trying to claim this land for themselves, that they can then use to expand their plantations. But it would be incorrect to view this conflict entirely through the lens of class. These are patriot landowners, and these are loyalist landowners, and both of them own slaves. There are patriot backwoodsmen, and there are loyalist ones. In fact, many people are viewing this conflict in terms of whose land or wealth they're going to get when the conflict ends. Loyalists assume that patriot lands will be stripped from them when the British win, and that they'll be able to absorb all of these for themselves. Small loyalist farmers think they'll become richer landowners, while larger ones think they'll be able to remove their rivals. Backwoodsmen think that the British can be used to force their rivals out of their territory. Meanwhile, patriot landowners assume that when the colonists win, they'll be able to take the loyalist lands for themselves, and any loyalists will be forced off their lands as traitors. Unsurprisingly, the outbreak of war means that this entire area turns into a mess of personal vendettas and retaliation. The northern colonies and the British view the South as being disinterested and disengaged from the wider war. But the truth is that there's almost a civil war going on between the Patriots and the Loyalists. Both sides form militia companies, and there are dozens and dozens of battles that are fought between them where there are no British and no colonial soldiers involved. There is a guerrilla war going on between personal enemies that only nominally has anything to do with the wider conflict, and the British step right into this when they show up thinking that everything is good and peaceful. Their strategy is to begin this whole thing by taking the largest southern port of Charleston, South Carolina, and it immediately turns into a huge mess because it turns out that Charleston is filled with Patriot sentiment. As a result, a siege breaks out. Now, the British do eventually take the city, but they find that they are now surrounded by people who are less interested in the revolution and more interested in having the British settle their personal vendettas. In fact, while the British had hopes that they could raise a large number of loyalist militiamen to supplement their own forces, they find that not only do not enough of them turn out to actually help the British, but many of the ones that do appear and then go off on their own to fight their own battles. Furthermore, owing to the defeats of various loyalist militias by Patriot militias, the actual number of usable loyalist militias turns out to be pretty small. So what does this have to do with slavery and the economy? As I said, the Southern conflict comes down to a question of who is going to benefit from what when it actually ends. And this is often a question of what lands and what properties are going to be available to who when the losers are branded as traitors. So, the British make what is perhaps the greatest blunder that they possibly could have in this moment. Now, going back a few years to 1775, one Lord Dunmore of Virginia had tried to bolster his own forces and undercut the forces of the Patriots by issuing what is known as Dunmore's Proclamation. What it does is promise freedom for any slave that took up arms against the colonists in service of the British. If a slave can run away from a Patriot master and shows up ready to fight for the British are going to declare that man free when the war is over, or so they claim. As you can probably imagine, this is a huge threat to the system of slavery in America, and in particular, it's a huge threat to the landowning plantation class that rely on slaves. Virginia's landowners, which were previously mostly split down the line, side overwhelmingly with the colonists at this point, because most of them do not like the idea of their slaves being promised freedom. And it's pretty obvious to understand why. The British are not checking to see if the people who are showing up are actually the slaves of patriots, loyalist landowners end up finding that their slaves are fleeing in equal numbers to the British. And the British, it turns out, are perfectly happy to accept them into the military without any questions. So by 1778 and 1779, the British still haven't learned that this is a bad idea. And so they begin applying this proclamation across the Carolinas. So suddenly, slave owners on both sides of this conflict, as well as would-be slave owners who were looking to seize the property of their enemies when the war ends, find that the entire economic system that they're looking to profit from is under threat. Slaves do in fact flee the plantations and do in fact join the British. And as a result, the support for the British collapses in the southern colonies. What looked like a no-brainer and an easy place to establish a base of support turns out to be a quagmire. But it's worth noting that the British are offering liberation for slaves for purely practical reasons, not moral ones. The British, as you might remember, are the biggest slave traders in the Western world at this point. They have absolutely no qualms about using slave labor. It underpins their entire economic model in many of the colonies. But because of this, they view this as a perfect way to disrupt the Southern economy, threaten the Patriots with economic ruin, and bolster their own forces. The British, simply put, look into the future, and they think that when they overcome the Patriots, when they've put down this rebellion, they can just import more slaves to replace the ones that they liberated. There's no thought to whether or not these people are people, or any rethinking of the system going on. To the British, this is economic warfare. Deprive the colonial landowners of manpower, bolster their own military with zealous troops who are hopefully looking for revenge, and destroy the ability of the American South to generate wealth for the cause. The British know that as so long as the war rages, the American colonies cannot easily import more slaves from West Africa because the Portuguese are a British ally. Slaves that are lost to the colonists cannot be easily replaced, whereas the British assume that they can just import more as needed when this is all over. And so as a result, this quasi-civil war that's going on in the American South becomes even more personal and even more heated, as landowners and backwoodsmen find themselves on the same side against the British for entirely different reasons. It's not a partnership that any of these people like. And even when the war ends, the actual conflicts between these groups is not going to be settled. And indeed, it's the actions of the British towards slavery that make the southern colonies so adamant that slavery is not a part of what would become the Declaration of Independence, and later the Constitution. Once the war becomes, for the landed class, about protecting their economic interests, meaning protecting slavery, their idea of economic liberty means the liberty to import slaves and use slave labor. So it's negligent of me if I didn't reiterate that the British at no point see this as anything but economic warfare. When the war ends, many of the men and women who fled these plantations to join the British find themselves being transported to other British colonies in the Caribbean. There, they're going to work the plantations that are already established and still under British rule. In the end, much of what the British promised them is never realized. They don't view these people as people. These people are tools to be wielded as needed against their enemies. Now, obviously, this entire situation is going to repeat itself after a few more decades, when the American Civil War brings into full view the problem of trying to proclaim liberty for everyone while also declaring slavery as a logical thing to practice. But the moral questions that will be asked are not yet being asked, and we shouldn't act like the people at the time had huge problems with it. Many of them are more outraged by the idea that the British would target slavery and seized what they viewed as their property, rather than the idea that these are people that they are talking about. And that is essentially the entire economic story of the Revolution. Now, we can see clearly, I think, how and why it developed in the North and why actions taken by the British eventually influenced what the colonists cared about. We can see how the economics and actions by the British solidified a culture and a way of life and a way of thinking in the American South, and how these two distinct ideas of what liberty means are influenced by the economic systems that were threatened during this conflict. So hopefully, you now have a better grasp of the many, many complex ideas that underpin all of the talk about freedom and equality and liberty and every other buzzword. And so you now have a better idea of what the people were actually thinking about, and not just what they were saying. Remember, history is never just one thing. It's always many things, depending on what lens you're using to examine it.